Now here we see the primary motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. About these two, I'll talk in details in separate parts. However, it will be very helpful to briefly introduce them here. The primary motor cortex is located in the precentral gyrus, whereas the somatosensory cortex is located in the postcentral gyrus. In both cases, we have maps, a motor map in the primary motor cortex and a sensory map in the sensory cortex. Just to give you an idea what this map is all about. In fact, it's about the density of the receptors in the corresponding parts of the body. So you see here, for instance, the hand is overrepresented. So is the tongue also, and the lips. So the more receptors we have, the higher the representation. Okay? For instance, we need the hand for all sorts of things to touch and move. We need a very large number of receptors, including mechanoreceptors. So we have a very high density of receptors in the hand, which is why the hand is overrepresented in both the motor map and the sensory map. I'll talk about this in details in a separate part. Here we see central control of the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. These two, the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, I'll talk about it in details in a separate part. Just to give you an idea, I will compare the two. So here, we have visceral motor nuclei in the hypothalamus. Okay? These two I'll discuss in details in a separate part. So now we have here the brainstem and here the spinal cord. Here we have the preganglionic neuron. This is the first neuron. Or the preganglionic neuron may start off somewhere in any segment of the spinal cord. So we have here the input from visceral motor nuclei in the hypothalamus. So then we have here the input going down to the preganglionic neurons, which may be in the brainstem or in the spinal cord. Then here we have the autonomic ganglia. This is where we synapse on the second neuron, the postganglionic neuron. Okay, so then we have the affected organs, smooth muscles, glands, or cardiac muscle, adipocytes, and so on and so forth. So to summarize, preganglionic neurons, postganglionic neurons. Now in the case of the somatic system, we have an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. Now the upper motor neuron normally starts off in the primary motor cortex. Then we have here somatic motor nuclei of brainstem. Okay, so this is the upper motor neuron, whether be it here or here. So synapses in this case on the lower motor neuron. You can see here the skeletal muscles. But again, the lower motor neuron may be somewhere here in any segment of the spinal cord. So the first neuron, the upper motor neuron, starts off at the motor cortex, and then it synapses on the lower motor neuron, either in the brainstem or in the spinal cord. So two neurons, upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. I have some more notes here for you. Somatic nervous system, SNS. We need it for conscious and subconscious control of skeletal muscles. Pathway, remember, an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. Lower motor neuron may be controlled by reflexes based in the spinal cord or brain. Upper motor neurons' cell bodies originate either from the motor cortex or brainstem. Now here we see the hierarchical control of movement. We here have the so-called pyramidal and extrapyramidal tracts. These are descending tracts, which we need for the hierarchical control of movement. Now, I am not going to talk in this part about the pyramidal and extrapyramidal tracts in details. You'll learn this in more details in anatomy courses, but also in physiology. However, I prefer to focus on the concepts. So this requires some learning by heart. So I'm going to skip it. I'm only going to include some details that you need for understanding of some concepts in this part. So in a way, I'm only going to introduce the pyramidal tract from certain aspects. Here I have also a list for both tracts, the pyramidal tract and the extrapyramidal tracts. You will be asked about these in particular in anatomy, but also in some neurophysiological courses and exams. Please note that the lower motor neuron is always excitatory, meaning once activated, can only be excitatory in nature. This is not the case for the upper motor neuron. I'll discuss some details. The upper motor neurons, okay, they modulate the activity of lower motor neurons and thus muscle tone through what is known as descending inhibition. Now, in the spinal cord, we have lots of interneurons. They may be either inhibitory or excitatory. The upper motor neurons modulate the activity of lower motor neurons via the inhibitory interneurons. So they regulate inhibitory interneurons and their effect on alpha and gamma motor neurons. Remember, I talked about alpha and gamma motor neurons in previous parts. Loss of upper motor neuron control or input results in loss of descending inhibition. So in a way, what we would like to prevent is the following. We don't want the lower motor neurons to be hyperactive, because hyperactivity of lower motor neurons would lead to hyperreflexes, exaggerated reflexes. In order to prevent this from happening, we need the upper motor neurons. So they regulate, they modulate the activity of the motor neuron, the lower motor neurons. Glutamate is the neurotransmitter. Here is the pyramidal tract. So this is the upper motor neuron in the primary motor cortex. In a pyramidal tract, in which we have 80% of the neurons, please follow the following route. Here is the upper motor neuron, goes down, 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 through the pons, and then to the medulla. This is where 80% of the neurons cross over to the opposite side. I have here some notes for you. Pyramidal deconstruction, okay? 80% of the neurons cross to the opposite side and continue to the spinal cord, where they form the corticospinal tract. Okay, so this is the pyramidal tract. Remember, this is for voluntary control. Pyramidal tract is for voluntary control. Extrapyramidal is for involuntary control. Now let's discuss two types of pathologies: flaccid versus spastic paralysis. Lower motor control, lower motor damage, left or right hand sided. So damage or disease, this can be from viruses or any other causes. So damage or disease of lower motor neurons leads to flaccid paralysis. Why? Remember, the lower motor neurons are always excitatory. If the lower motor neuron is damaged, the muscle may not be able to be excited. Okay? So damage or disease of lower motor neurons leads to flaccid paralysis of muscles on the same side of the body. Under these conditions, muscles lack voluntary control and reflexes. The muscles remain flaccid due to decreased or lost muscle tone. Now, let's see the difference between damage in the lower motor neurons and damage in the upper motor neurons. So, injury or disease of upper motor neurons causes spastic paralysis of muscles located on the opposite side of the body. Why? Remember, this is the root, the pyramidal band. We have the upper motor neuron starting off here in the primary motor cortex, and it crosses over to the opposite side at the medulla. Okay, 80% of the fibers. So, injury or disease of upper motor neurons causes spastic paralysis of muscles located on the opposite side of the body. In this condition, the muscle tone is increased. Reflexes are exaggerated, remember, because the upper motor neurons, if damaged, they may not be able anymore to modulate the activity of the upper motor neurons, the lower motor neurons. So the lower motor neurons would be hyperactive. So this is why the reflexes would be exaggerated in that case. So if we have injury or disease of the upper motor neurons damage, so there's no way we can modulate the activity of the lower motor neurons. This results in exaggerated or pathological reflexes, hyperreflexes. I hope this was helpful.